The barbecue smoke curled into the summer air, and I thought it was going to be a perfect Saturday. I had spent 3 hours preparing potato salad, marinating chicken, setting up string lights across the backyard for what was supposed to be a simple family gathering. My husband Richard stood by the grill laughing with his brother while I carried a tray of drinks toward the folding tables we had set up near the pool. That was the moment everything changed. As I turned the corner near the patio, I didn't see her standing there, scrolling through her phone with her back half turned. I bumped into her shoulder just slightly, just enough to make her phone wobble in her hand. It was an accident, a pure, honest accident. But before I could even say sorry, she spun around and screamed at me in front of everyone. "Don't ever touch me again," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to silence the entire backyard. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. And I stood there, frozen, holding a tray of lemonade, wondering how a simple bump could turn into a public humiliation. If you think that was the shocking part, wait until you hear what my husband did next, because what happened in the next 10 seconds changed the entire course of our marriage. Richard walked over, not to comfort me, not to ask if I was okay, but to stand beside his daughter and look at me with a coldness I had never seen in his eyes before. "Apologize to her, or leave," he said flatly, like I was a stranger who had wandered into his family's private event. I searched his face for even a flicker of doubt, a hint that he understood how unfair this was, but there was nothing. Just silence, just judgment, just 22 years of marriage evaporating in front of 30 relatives holding paper plates. I want you to imagine that feeling for a moment. The feeling of standing in your own backyard in the house you helped pay for, surrounded by people who used to call you family, and realizing that in your husband's eyes, you had just become disposable. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set the tray down on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked into the house. I grabbed my purse, my sunglasses, and my keys, and without saying another word to anyone, I walked out the front door and got into my car. But here's the part nobody at that barbecue expected, the part that would come crashing down on all of them just hours later. Before I tell you what happened when they got home, I need you to understand something about my marriage that none of those relatives standing in that backyard knew. Richard's daughter, Vanessa, had never accepted me. Not once in the 6 years I had been married to her father. She was 26 years old, still living in an apartment Richard paid for, still calling him every time she needed money, still treating me like an intruder in a life she believed belonged only to her and her father. I had tried everything. Birthday gifts, patient conversations, silent tolerance of her rudeness at every holiday dinner. I told myself that time would soften her, that eventually she would see I wasn't trying to replace her mother, only to build a life alongside her father. But that afternoon at the barbecue, something in me finally broke, and I realized tolerance without respect is just quiet suffering. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible in your own home, I want you to know you are not alone, and I want you to stay with me. Because what I did next is something I never thought I would have the courage to do. I didn't drive aimlessly. I drove straight to my sister's house, sat at her kitchen table, and finally let myself cry. Not out of weakness, but out of years of exhaustion finally catching up to me. My sister Diane had warned me about this marriage from the very beginning. She used to say that Richard treated Vanessa like a queen and me like hired help who happened to share his bed. I had defended him every single time. But sitting there, replaying his cold voice in my head, apologize to her or leave, I finally understood that Diane had been right all along. While I sat at that table, my phone would not stop buzzing. Richard was calling, then texting, then calling again. I let it ring. For the first time in years, I let myself feel something other than guilt. Around 8 that evening, after the barbecue had ended and the guests had gone home, Richard finally arrived at my sister's front porch, his face pale, his voice shaking in a way I had never heard before. He said Vanessa had told him something after I left, something that made him realize he had made a terrible mistake standing beside her instead of standing beside me. And this is where the story takes a turn that even I never saw coming. According to Richard, after I walked out of the barbecue, several of our relatives, including his own brother, confronted Vanessa about her behavior. They told her that she had crossed a line, that an accidental bump did not deserve a public scene, and that Richard's choice to humiliate his own wife in front of family was inexcusable. Vanessa, cornered and exposed, broke down and admitted something she had kept hidden for years. She confessed that she had been secretly recording conversations between me and Richard for months, twisting my words, showing edited clips to her father to make me look controlling and cold, all in an effort to convince him that our marriage was toxic and that he should leave me. The bump at the barbecue wasn't really about being touched. It was the excuse she had been waiting for, a stage to finally push her father toward the ending she had been engineering all along. I sat in my sister's living room listening to Richard's trembling confession, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and heartbreak. Vindication because I finally had proof that I wasn't imagining the coldness, the manipulation, the years of feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. Heartbreak because the man I had loved for 6 years had been blind to his own daughter's manipulation, choosing her narrative over my reality every single time we clashed. Richard begged me to come home that night. He said he understood now that he had failed me as a husband, that Vanessa's actions had opened his eyes to a pattern he refused to see before. But understanding does not erase the moment he stood in that backyard and told his own wife to apologize or leave. Some wounds cannot be healed with an apology delivered only after the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If you've made it this far, I need you to comment below with one word. The word you think best describes what Vanessa really wanted that day, because her true motive is more calculated than you think, and I promise the next chapter of this story will leave you speechless. I did not go home with Richard that night. I told him I needed time, real time, to decide whether a marriage built on his daughter's manipulation and his own blindness was worth saving. As I write this, months later, our marriage remains in that fragile space between forgiveness and finality. Vanessa no longer speaks to her father after the truth came out about her recordings. Richard has begged for a second chance, promising therapy, promising boundaries, promising the husband I always needed him to be. But promises made after exposure are different from promises made out of love, and only time will tell if his changed words become changed actions. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe, because next week I am sharing the moment Richard's brother revealed the recordings to me directly, and what was on them will make you question everything you just heard.